Okay, welcome everybody, and welcome to all of the attendees, and welcome to our panel of experts. Today, I am Mattea Colajanni, founder and chair of WiHTL. Since the COVID-19 outbreak, we have responded to the needs of our, what we call our collaboration community, providing access to technical experts. We've had HR leaders sharing their experiences and learning from each other, benchmarking their response to the crisis. At the core of everything that we're trying to do is to put our people at the center of what we do. We're supporting and encouraging leaders across hospitality, travel, and leisure to keep people at the heart of their decision-making process in a very diverse and inclusive way. Before I introduce our panelists and my team, Joanna and Gina, who everybody already knows, I would like to encourage you to ask questions as we go along. For those of you who may have not used the Zoom technology before, there is a chat box. Quite a few people have said their hellos to the panelists. You can send questions to the panelists, but you can also share the questions with everybody, panelists and attendees, or you can use the Q&A box, which you find at the bottom of your screen. Please do engage with us. If you want to actually ask a question live, I will have to unmute you. So just send me a message, and between Gina and myself, I will try and see that you want to participate. But the value of these conversations is in hearing what our experts have to say, our panelists have to say, but it's also in you asking questions and engaging in a dialogue with us. I don't have to say much in terms of the unprecedented situation that we are in. We know, we've heard it plenty of times, our industry is at the back of the queue. Although there are positive signs that I know, many of you are thinking about opening. Some of you have reopened sites, and I'll just mention two things that were on the BBC News this morning. Airbnb reporting a jump in bookings from Europeans. That was this morning, hoping to get a holiday. There were a huge queues of cars this morning at the Basingstoke branch of KFC, everybody trying to get their KFC fix after 2 months of lockdown, and European leaders, particularly, I say my Prime Minister, I'm half and half, but the Italian, I should say, Prime Minister this morning hinting at Italians will have a summer holiday, whatever that actually means. But for today, I brought this panel together to discuss the global challenges that leaders across our industry are facing, reflect on what organizations are considering, need to consider doing when preparing what somebody here in the community has called the never normal again phase. So the way we'll run the webinar is I will introduce you to the three panelists. We'll set, or each one of them will share some of their reflections with a slightly different spin depending on their background, and then we will open up to questions. So be ready, because as you know, some of you know very well, I'll start calling you and bringing you into the conversation if you don't ask questions in the chat box. So we will start with Matthew Blagg, who is the CEO of Criticaleye. A few words about Criticaleye. Criticaleye is the largest community of CEOs, CFOs, chairpersons. I would say in Europe, not just in the UK, but with presence in Asia as well. So he will share his reflections through a leadership lens and your experience dealing and talking to senior leaders across a variety of different industries. We'll move then on to Olly Purnell, managing partner at Q5. Q5 is strategic consultancy operating in a number of different countries worldwide. And Olly will share his perspective through a strategic lens and his reflections on helping businesses responding to the challenges confronting them. And then we'll move to Elliott Goldstein, managing partner of the MBS Group, and together with Criticaleye, a long-term supporter of WiHTL. And Elliott will focus on his reflections looking at the recruitment lens, and having talked recently, like many, like Olly and Matthew, talked to a lot of our senior leaders, CEOs and non-executive directors and chairpersons over the last few months. So Matthew, we'll start with you, really looking at a little bit reflections on the last few weeks, but also looking at the return phase.
Okay, I'll give you sort of thanks, Tara, and I'll give everyone a sort of simplistic overview. And I think anything one says is simplistic because there's so many nuances to how this plays out. But we obviously work in multi-geographical area, multi-industry area, multiple role area. And so we've got some unusual insight in terms of that spread. And I suppose sort of we sort of split this down into three phases. Phase one being the crisis and the reaction to that. The second phase, partial emergence. And then the third phase is new normal. And I think if I'm brutally honest, for leadership, the first phase is probably the easiest phase, well, the first and the third. In sense of crisis is an opportunity for teams to come together. Generally, most leadership teams are able to line up on that. And it's a very fast reactive point. And generally, you see what's happened is most organizations putting things together, focus on cash, where is the cash, understanding and is moving people into the right places. Obviously, unusually in this scenario, everyone working from home, but reacting to it. And obviously in the UK, the government has furloughed, which has protected roles. That isn't the case on a global standpoint. And you're beginning to see some of the cracks appearing on a global position. And so organizations that have a global remit. For example, if you take healthcare in the UK, the NHS obviously is government run. And as such, actually, there are places which aren't at full capacity now, but everyone's being paid. In America, there are places that aren't at full capacity and the people aren't being paid because they're private hospitals and they're laying people off, which is why you're seeing the spike in terms of unemployment in the States. I think that if I'm honest, I think from a leadership perspective, we're heading towards the most difficult point in this. And why is that? Most leaders now are really focusing on what happens next. And the two phases of that, the sort of partial emergence phase and then the sort of new normal phase, to use that term. And I think that the difficulty with this is that in the last 10 years, we've seen a massive drive towards analytics driving decision-making. And I think the difficulty now is analytics is going to lag. And so you've got a really difficult position coming forward where CEOs, boards, executive teams are going to have to base decisions without having the analytical evidence to support it. And that's going to challenge on all levels. I think the alignment that I think most organizations will have seen at all levels probably of it will start to creak, because you're going to start looking at difficult decisions. So organizations are going to look at, you've seen the Virgin decision because they're looking at it going, actually, we have to make decisions now that go beyond the short term. And you'll increasingly see that happening. And so most of the organizations that we're working, and we've got a spectrum of companies in Criticaleye, from the ones who are in a really difficult place, and sadly, the sector we're talking about today has got more of those, to organizations that are massively outperforming. So some of the technical solutions obviously are struggling with volumes. So you've got this sort of massive paradigm. But I think we are coming towards this point where it's going to get more difficult around the decisions. You're still going to have 2 to 3 tiers of speed in organizations. I mean, working from home is one thing. Working from home with your children is completely different. And what degree of your employees will be able to actually go back to normal is really questionable. If you take a global solution, different geographies are in different places, not only in phases of where we are, but actually more in terms of the way the governments have reacted. And so, again, as a global organisation, it's going to put more pressure to have solutions. The element of stakeholder alignment, and I thought it was a good thing to sort of throw that insight up. You're moving towards a point where the stakeholders are going to be pulling in different directions. So the expectation of shareholders, government, customers, employees are going to be different at different points. And I think that you can't underestimate the challenge that's going to lead towards the CEO and the executive team, and obviously the senior management. And I think that is increasingly becoming and will become the story and the challenge, to keep that alignment. And I think great leadership teams are going to be challenged through this. Poor leadership teams will unpick themselves. And I think that if you haven't got the analytics to support your decisions, you are going to have strong leaders who are effectively able to carry people through it. So we're seeing that. And the other side to this is, no one knows what the consumer will do the other side of this. So we just had a brief sort of before we came on around cruise ships, and there's a spectrum of how the consumer will react. I think the key fundamental question around that is where they are economically. So if economically they're relatively untouched, then their decision making will drift back quite fast around that place. If the economics get tighter, then I think it gets much more, you'll see much more change. There'll be no question within this, the one area that we're supporting all of our members to invest in is innovation. Indeed, our whole discussion with organisations at a board level is, if you turn that tap off, and I'll give you an insight. I was talking to a CEO of an oil business this morning, where they're talking about turning off long-term CapEx spend. If they do that, they won't be in the market in 5 years. Because the reality is, you can turn things off for a bit, but ultimately your future is key. And you're going to get into these discussions at a board level around the current business and where the business needs to be. It is an opportunity in that sense. You will see more innovation in this phase than through any other phase. It is an opportunity to change. So it's about harnessing those things. It will be hard though. And I don't think anyone can underestimate those difficulties and the challenges. And this is not a sprint. It's probably a 2-year piece. So any leader who's in there and anyone in a leadership role has got to look at a 2-year scenario now rather than a 3 months. And maybe you've got to break that down into quarters, but your planning has got to be for 2 years. And that's a sort of overview. And obviously I'm sort of throwing it open to questions from there, but as you go through.
Thank you, Matt. We'll move to Olly next, and we'll take questions at the end.
Yes, thanks very much, Tara. Actually, one of the things Matt said there before, I talked a little bit through the sort of organisational implications, which I totally agree with, and I'm not sure if enough people are saying this at the moment, that we've grown up in the last 2 to 3 years about being data obsessed and looking at customer analytics. Customer analytics right now is worthless, frankly. So it's a really good point you made there, Matt. I think we've started doing clairvoyant sessions genuinely on a Friday evening with a bunch of business leaders, because right now, last month there would have been a large market for hair clippers because people can't go to hairdressers at the moment. Barbers, frankly, I need a cut myself. But the reality is, that's not the new normal. That just happens to be now. Data supporting that from last autumn. So there's a lot of entrepreneurialism, a lot of instinct, a lot of intuitions required at the moment, which can be used alongside data. But I think you're absolutely right on that point. I mean, starting from the very beginning, I think we're seeing a triple play here. It's a language I'm using with my team at the moment. The pandemic has brought societal, economic, and financial challenges all at once. I've been working for about 26 years. I've never seen anything like this, including, the credit crunch was nothing like this at all. This is affecting every single country on the planet. And unless you're the manufacturer of hand sanitizers or ventilators or the hair clippers I was talking about a couple of minutes ago. Most industries are really suffering, none more so than the esteemed guests on this particular webinar. I really know how difficult it is at the moment to be in the travel, hospitality and leisure. If you go back to January, what have I seen? What are my reflections on helping businesses? I am going to slightly admonish actually some leaders, including myself on this front. I think at the end of December, the reports from Wuhan about the epidemic, the COVID, I don't think any of us were particularly well prepared in the West. And I think my observations, I went to Singapore at the end of January, my observations going out there, people in masks, people wearing gloves. I came back to the UK in February. We were still, miles away from that. And there must be a number of businesses represented on this call today who have hotels out in Asia, who would have heard the pain that their local ops were going through at that time, and didn't necessarily hear what was being said. And I include myself in that, and many other business leaders and organizations. So one of the things that we've observed recently, that lack of preparedness, is the need for businesses to get much better at building business resilience and recovery capability. I wanted to quickly, if I can, if this works, quickly share. This is it, I think. Is this working? I was going to quickly share something. Can you see that?
Yes.
So this is something that we've had we do a little bit of resilience planning for organizations. This is something that business leaders are doing. You don't need our support to do it, but so that you won't be surprised again, we know that COVID is not going away until there's a vaccine for it. And as Matt said earlier on, this might be an 18-month, 2-year thing. So if you start at the very top, we have to anticipate that there's likely to be a second wave, potentially even a third wave. And as industry sectors, we can't be surprised by that. So we have to be able to assess what that means. We have to know what we might have to deal with again once there's a re-emergence takes place. What can we do to prevent some of the cataclysmic things that have happened to our businesses over the course of the last 7 to 8 weeks so that we're better protected next time? How can we prepare better so that we're ready for the next wave? How do we respond? Now, this thing that I'm showing you here, which you can either take a photo of now, or if you want, I can email it to you later on. These are some of the things that I'm hearing CEOs and leadership teams in FTSE 100 companies and elsewhere tackled seriously now. We have had pandemics in the past, like swine flu and like SARS and like MERS, that didn't really impact the West. This thing really has impacted us, and no business can afford to not take this seriously again. I was going to repeat some of the stuff that Matt's already said, actually. The first wave that we've seen from organizations is to survive. So it's been about preserving cash, asking employees to sacrifice salaries if they can, furloughing a number of staff, looking for rent moratoriums. I'm sure all of your organizations have been involved in that and trying to lower your costs. But it's also about managing reputations. So this first wave is about being seen to be compassionate and doing the best possible thing you can do for the people around you. And I think lots of organizations and lots of the leaders have really stood tall in this moment and done some great things. The other important thing in the first wave has been about communication all the time. Communicate to employees, to customers, to shareholders, to stakeholders, to everyone you're involved in. I think most businesses are anticipating that this will be a V-shaped recession. But again, with Matt, I'm not sure it is necessarily going to be a V-shaped recession. There's no certainty at all. And I heard a good quote the other day that people will respect clarity. People will punish certainty. We can't be certain about things. And I think that businesses have to be prepared for a very difficult period of time, which is why I was going to show you this other slide, which is talking about before you re-emerge. It's important. Again, this is not something you need any support from. You don't need consulting support on this. But for those of you in senior leadership positions or HR directors, you need to be looking at your organisation and the impact of re-emergence. What social distancing will mean for your business. How is it going to impact your organisation structure? How is it going to impact your people? How is it going to impact your process? These are the key things you need to look at before people go back into the workplace. And I suspect a number of people will continue to work from home, those in non-ops roles. So that's the second thing I wanted to say, that before people re-emerge, you need to do a proper audit, a proper scan of what impact it's going to have on your organisation. Again, I can send you that, it's very, very high level, but I can send this to you later on. The final thing I was going to say is it's important to create a compelling future blueprint for your people. So when they come back in and they understand whether they're working in restaurants and they're chefs who have to remain 2 meters apart, so therefore it's going to impact their productivity, or whether you're working in a dining area which has had to be extended with the use of marquees and tents and things. Where are we now? Where do we need to be in the next 3 to 6 to 18 months? What are the design principles we're going to have in place? What's the core work we should be doing? What are the things we can't be doing in the future? What are the things that we won't be able to do over the course of the next 12 months? And how do we group this work? So these are some of the things that we're saying. Once you're back in the workplace, there has to be a coherent, logical and emotional connection to the way work is being done. And leaders need to be able to express that really clearly and really coherently. The final thing I wanted to say, I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen now. In fact, I don't know how to stop sharing my screen. You're going to have to tell me in a minute. The final thing I wanted to say is I think your sectors, here we are, I can pause share. Thank you very much. I think your sectors in the medium to longer term have reason to be really optimistic. The Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920, the world wars, the 9/11 disaster that we had, all these things, travel, leisure, hospitality, they have come back and they've come back strong. So the other important thing is to remain optimistic that this is a painful period of time, but people's desire to explore the world, to socialize and to enjoy life will remain and will come back really, really fast and hard.
Thank you, Olly. Let's move on to Elliott.
Great, thank you, Taya. And just before I start, I just want to pay public credit to Taya and her team at WiHTL for the phenomenal leadership role they've played over the last few months, above and beyond the call of duty. So really, thank you. So yeah, I won't repeat anything either Matthew or Olly have said, but I want to just suggest a slightly different set of paradigms, hopefully to look this through, which I think reflect some of the leadership and talent challenges possibly our sector is going to be facing. So the first is on the survival phase. I don't know about you, but when you hear the British population is baking sourdough, binging on Netflix, just has so much time on their hand, I think they're having a very different experience to lockdown than anyone within the travel, leisure, hospitality sector, where the survival piece has been an absolutely full-time job. And I think that will not change. We will possibly go into a phase 2, a phase 3 of this. So survival will now become, I guess, the foundational elements to what we need to deal with as an industry. I see it like an orchestra, though. That's one instrument, the survival instrument, and that's already a full-time job. On top of that, we've now got to bring in another instrument that, if some of these announcements are as we suspect, and indeed through the European announcements of this week, will happen sooner rather than later. And that's going back into a trading mentality, actually working out how we try and commercialise our businesses. And as both the other two panelists have said, in a world without data, there's going to be, I think, two things that we see happening here. I think, first and foremost, we're going to go back to old school hospitality. We're going to go back to GMs walking the floor, talking to guests, talking to customers, just a much better intuitive sense of what's going on. And we're going to need to keep that same entrepreneurialism that we've seen during COVID happens here. So when a new trend is seen, such as hair clippers, or when we're going to need to go at it at full speed and at full tilt to ensure that we can maximize that. And one thing I would say is that historically, that role of entrepreneur within our sector has possibly been the role that a founder has taken. You know, they're the people that have significantly changed models and sectors over the last few decades within the travel, leisure, hospitality space. Many of those founders are no longer with the businesses, and I think there possibly is going to be a gap around the leadership table in terms of the entrepreneur, the innovator. So we have the survival instruments, and then the trading instruments. Trading will be absolutely key in terms of commercial performance. And on top of that, then there's an ongoing transformation element, sort of beyond the initial cost out elements that we've seen in the early phases. That's going to be things, you know, on the one hand, significantly shedding property. It's going to be refinancing aircrafts. It's going to be investments in AI. It's going to be investments in supply chain. It's going to be very significant investments in digital. And there's going to be the whole series of very practical things about how we set up our businesses to perform in the new normal. You know, physically taking chairs out of cinemas, closing off those middle seats on airplanes, or whatever the operational transfer elements need to be. And in and of itself, you know, that's the sort of change we normally drive through over years, if not decades. We're going to need to drive through over the course of a matter of months. Transpose on top of that as well, sort of a fourth instrument, and that's, you know, what I would describe as the new horizons. Undoubtedly, customer behaviour has changed as a result of COVID-19. I don't think any of us yet know how our businesses do need to change, what the appetite will be in the future for international travel, for over 70s going on cruises, what the role of automation will need to be in terms of machine-driven coffee delivery or QSR, etc. So I think the whole sector will need to, in a way, sort of almost throw out some of the thinking today as to what the customer wants, because what the customer wants in the future may be very different from what the services we provide today. And then, if that's not enough change to deal with, I think there's probably a fifth element, and that's around defence. You know, it's highly likely that a number of businesses within our sector are going to come under attack over the coming months from aggressive institutional investors or hedge funds that are looking to exploit what are fundamentally good businesses and have a fundamentally strong proposition and seek to change ownership. So I think number one challenge from where I sit, from a leadership perspective and from a talent perspective, is simply around headspace. It's the ability to keep these 5 plates spinning all in one go and giving each of them the attention and priority that they deserve. I think in addition, some of those plates are possibly in conflict with each other. So for instance, you know, the New Horizons piece may be in conflict with the transformation piece, i.e. you can't transform and create the businesses of the future until you know what the business of the future is you're looking to create. And that there's probably some skills around leadership tables that simply aren't there at the moment, particularly with regard to transformation. We may be okay on, say, property, supply chain, but do we really have within the sector the digital capabilities, the AI capabilities, etc.? And then the last point I'd leave is that this piece is not easy from a leadership and talent perspective. It's the balance. You're already seeing fatigue around the table, and that's only with one instrument really in the orchestra playing. And as Olly said, this is going to last years, not months. How do you keep that momentum up? How do you stop tensions from happening around the board table? How do you keep the confidence of your workforce, the frontline people that are delivering the services? and very possibly there may be some sacrificial lambs from people around the top table that will need to exit as we move into a new phase of renewal and need to put a new face on the future of our sectors. And lastly, I think there's a piece around personal resilience and will individual leaders themselves, number one, be able to keep this up, but will they want to do it? And will they be able to do that in a way that's true to their own personal value set?
Thank you very much, Elliott. There is a wealth there of inspiration and themes to explore. I'll start with, I know that there are a few questions, we'll come to that. One thought, I was talking to one of the CEOs from within the sector, global business, been in business for a very, very long time. And he said to me, Tia, none of us have experienced throughout our career anything like this. We've mentioned SARS, we've mentioned the financial crisis, 9/11. This is all of these things put together on a global scale, affecting all of us on a professional level, on a personal level. So, to your point, Elliott, about, skills and the capabilities, lack of, data analytics, what are you seeing as you speak to leaders across different industries, in our industry? How are they keeping their, motivation going in the face of all that is going on? How are they able to, deal with the business continuity piece, the survival piece, but also now looking at the next phase, the return, the horizon? I mean, all in one. Matthew, you talked about, the strongest leadership teams here will go through this phase, the weak ones will not. What are you seeing as you discuss these issues with, your members, chairpersons at board level, CEOs level? What are the challenges there from a leadership perspective?
If you want me to go first, I mean, I slightly worry that everyone thinks they've never seen things before. I think certain places that's true, but certain places have seen scenarios like this. And I think that we slightly have a element of that we're worse off than the generation before. And I think leaders have probably had a really easy run. And we're probably at a point when, you're exposed. And I think one of my learnings through life is you never really know whether people are competent until you get to a good crisis. And that'll be true for all the organizations that we're talking about. I mean, organizations that are well led and have the ability to react will do incredibly well. They'll do difficult things fast. They'll line the people up. And they'll keep the momentum in the right balance. They won't drop down. I mean, I always worry for people and executive teams that are operationally where the leadership drop down, because they're now exposed, and you can't drop down forever. And if this is all about a medium-term trend, you've got to lead. You've got to be strategic. So it's going to expose your base skills. I don't think though, how your team will react until you see it. I don't think you go into leadership unless you're prepared for these points. So for me, if you take the collapse in 2008, and I worked with CEOs and boards across that period, a huge number weren't there. Those businesses weren't there by the end of the year. But actually, the reality it is, that's why you go into leadership. You're going to have to work twice or three times as hard for half as much. And that is the phase, so your normal metrics of performance are going to disappear. But if you get it right, you'll create the next dynasty, and you'll do right for everyone. And I think if you're in the wrong position now financially, you probably should wave the white flag. I mean, you'd be better off. I mean, I had a conversation with a CEO who is in your sector yesterday, and it's a brutal discussion because I don't think he can get that business into 2021. And then you've got to start asking yourself, when is it the right point? Are you prepared to take it through? And if you are, it's going to be a very bloody journey. And to hold your people, they're all furloughed at the moment, but actually holding that together And are you really prepared for it? And he's got to start answering that question today, because he's got an opportunity now to actually move it into another vehicle, or effectively he's got to live through it. It's going to be really hard, but that is why you're in leadership. And so you've got to recognize these tough points are the points when you're paid your salary and you get your rewards, even though other people might be doing this. I had a conversation also this week with a private equity CEO who exited his business in February, the last deal to get off for $4.5 billion. And he's sitting on a lot of zeros. And of course, he thinks the whole thing's really easy. So you've got a spectrum. Sometimes you're lucky in life, and other times you're not. But in leadership, it equalizes, and you've got to react to it.
Yeah. One practical thing that I have seen some companies do to be able to address all of the challenges that you have all described, they have kept a team focused on the business as usual, and they have put in place using some of their high potential. So they have set up a plan ahead team because of the sheer volume of things that are taking place, and because there are so many different scenarios. And for global businesses, and we have here some of the attendees who have global responsibilities, there is just so much to keep up with, and it's physically impossible to deal with everything in the same team. So that kind of plan ahead, it goes back to the skills, it goes back to perhaps you don't have the skills. I mean, I know, Elliott, that you have looked into hiring some transformational people, and
no, definitely. I think it's a very valid point to say. So you ask, how are people going to be able to keep this up? And I think many businesses, particularly at the smaller end, are still trying to manage this by committee. I don't know how many of you sit on sort of daily COVID-19 calls between 1-3 hours long with the entire exco trying to address the issue. I guess what we're trying to encourage boards to do is to work out a way to work together better as an executive committee and to divide and conquer. So the board as is, CEO, CFO, focused on really the first two buckets that I described in my opening remarks, the COVID-19 immediate response and the trading the business today. And then two other roles, either existing people stepping into those roles or new roles, a chief transformation officer looking at, in effect, cost out, business model of the future, and driving the full program and PMO required to deliver that. And then a role that we're calling sort of chief horizon officer or chief strategy officer, a team, and it may all be the high pose that you described, that are relentlessly focused on the future and what the business model needs to look like for the future. And then that group comes together as an executive committee, but there are clearly differentiated responsibilities within that. And actually, interestingly, the non-executive board plays quite an interesting role in that, because they're obviously hearing voices from business as usual, transformation, and future, which is, if I have a common critique from the non-executives we're speaking to at the moment, is that they're only really hearing about COVID, maybe business as usual trading. They're not hearing nearly enough about the future. And because they have the headspace to think about the future, that's where they're at, and their executive teams are often a little bit further behind.
Olly, I'm going to come to you, because in the next 90 days, a lot of the companies that are here attending this webinar will have some very tough decisions to make. If and when the job retention scheme is going to stop, is going to be decreased in generosity and in size. Everybody, I know from the questions that we get on our WhatsApp group for HR leaders, everybody's thinking about, if the scheme is not extended, we will have to go into the restructuring phase. And even if it is extended on a partial terms, of 50% and whatever different formula that are being discussed, you know, a lot of businesses, we know they've appointed administrators, some of them, and some are really thinking about it's going to be redundancy. Some have been announced. You know, what is your perspective and advice to companies that are, you know, about to make that decision, looking at their businesses, and they've got a choice to make in terms of redesigning the organization and having to let people go?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a very difficult one to answer, because I know, I mean, these industry sectors that you represent are people businesses, and all of you have a pastoral responsibility for the people in it. I mean, I run my own company, and we have some people on furlough in my company too. I think it's unlikely that furlough will continue, beyond July probably. Who knows? I mean, again, there's no certainty on it. I think all organisations need to look at what has worked over the last 3 to 4 months. There are businesses on this call now, because I know some of the people, who've discovered new routes to market and have discovered new products. And I think if there's some proper oomph behind that, and it's got some longevity, it's important to look at those new services and those new product areas and think, right, can we invest in that? Can we redeploy some of our team coming back to us in those areas and grow those? But those, bits of your business which aren't likely to recover, and there will be parts of it that won't, you will have to restructure the business, and it's a painful thing. It's never a pleasant thing to do. So I think there will, there undoubtedly will be those tough decisions that will need to be made. People on this call will have hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are furloughed at the moment. In effect, parts of your business have been put into hibernation for a period of time, and their costs are being covered by the government. If the market doesn't return, if customers don't return some of those parts of those businesses, you're going to have to switch them off.
Yeah,
I think so I think that the companies have got to really think through what's core, and it might be you might have to fund it, but you retain it, and what isn't. And I think that everyone needs to really assess what is it that makes your business future tick in the future. So, the individual yesterday I was talking to, the conversation was, what are the people in your organization that are fundamental to you coming out the other end? And whatever you do, you've got to protect that, because if they go, you don't come out. And I think for everyone, you've really got to understand that. And then you've got to understand how you finance it. And I think that, there's going to be a lot of, there's going to be brave decisions out there to carry cost, but we're going to have to fund it. And then there's going to be others that are going to cut harder. My comment is, if you cut too hard, you won't come out. So you've got to get the balance right. And it's going to be really difficult to get that balance right. My general view is you should be modelling this as though there was no furloughing. I slightly feel that it's been put in, and in my mind, it sort of has defended things, but it's going to come real quite soon. I think everyone's got to be modelling as though there is no furloughing.
I think the expectation, if I speak on behalf of the industry, the expectation is that for our industry, because we are being asked to wait until the end, we are at the back of the queue. You keep hearing that, so we're going to be asked to wait. And the lifting of the restrictions for us mean that there is a huge investment in the social distancing configurations in restaurants. That there is going to be a massive investment, and it might be not commercially viable to put in place these. I don't know if you've seen those cubicles. So there was a picture of an Amsterdam restaurant by the canal, and every table was in a Perspex cubicle. I mean, so anyway, there is an expectation that there will be some kind still of support for our industry because of the particular circumstances and the requirements. We shall see. We'll have to see. One other consideration is, on one end, there is all of this talk about the industry being affected. There is, we need to make people, we will have to make people redundant. Equally, some parts of our businesses have to hire people. Some people are leaving the industry altogether because they expect there will be redundancies. So how do you balance the message of letting people go with actually we still want to attract talent, and there is a question about the impact on our ability, the impact of this crisis on our ability to hire talent in the short to medium term. Perhaps, Elliott, I'll come to you from a recruitment perspective. What are you hearing from candidates? What is, I know that you and I have talked about some functions in particular in our industry, really considering it's time perhaps to move into technology or medical sector or somewhere else. What's your view on that?
So I think that given the leadership challenges that we as a sector now face, I mentioned digital AI technology, I mentioned supply chain, I mentioned property, I mentioned transformation, and you look at the leadership teams around the executive committees and most of the major businesses within our sector, it's clear that those specific skills do not exist around those tables, and actually in many cases don't exist at the levels beneath. So I think there is a very clear case in a number of companies, either on an interim basis or on a permanent basis, to bring in different types of leaders who can help solve very specific problems at this time. Now, and in all likelihood, actually, a lot of those talents will come from outside of the sector. So I think that's one, the specific need. I think number two is around the point I raised earlier around fatigue, and actually around simply people not working out in their current roles for whatever reason. One CEO and one HRD, I'm close to both of them. They've had a fundamental disagreement on strategy. Their relationship has deteriorated. The HRD has left the business. It never normally happens, but it all happened over the space of a week. They've onboarded a new HRD remotely on an interim basis. So there is going to be a lot of very short-term talent requirements, and it may make more sense to address some of those on an interim basis than possibly you would than you would normally do. You may also see this as an opportunity to, in effect, temporarily promote people internally from the business, and to give them a chance to step up, because actually it's a new energy and a new freshness that that you're looking for. I think that I would say that as a sector, we shouldn't at this stage undervalue the real need to get the sector. I actually think it's very, very hard at the moment to land from outside our world, in our world, and be effective from day one. So I think that those that are within our sector, we should be trying very, very hard to retain them in whatever form within the community. How attractive are we as travel, leisure, hospitality to the external community at the moment? I've got to say that it has changed. I think we've gone from being a sector that everyone wants to be a part of, to one which people view with an air of trepidation and risk. So I think we need to work much harder to get talent in from adjacent sectors, particularly into businesses that are distressed or about to be distressed. So I think the talent agenda is going to be one that's going to evolve both around a new set of roles, a set of immediate requirements. I need a leader to hit the ground tomorrow, and then possibly the opportunity to promote people internally into roles that possibly they wouldn't have otherwise been considered for. And obviously, to how do you do that from a messaging of overall you're letting people go, etc. I think very much this is around the over communication bit that I know everyone within the sector is doing, but it's also part of the messaging of an overall enterprise-wide transformation, and these roles being critical for creating the business model and also survival today.
Can I bring you back to something that, Olly, you mentioned earlier about preparation and level or the lack of, or the low response in terms of how businesses were prepared for something of this scale. And any thoughts you have and reflections on looking forward? You know, I see, you know, a lot of companies focused on return to work. I've not heard a lot in terms of potentially preparing for a phase 2 of the pandemic, a return, or a phase 3 of the pandemic. What would be your kind of guidance, or kind of key pointers to our attendees in terms of thinking about how they can support their leadership teams in thinking it's not just about this gradual return to work, let's also think about what if things go wrong again?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the only upsides of what's happened over the last 2 months or so here in the UK and in Europe is that we've experienced lockdown. We've experienced what it's like. We've tested our digital IT, our IT and stuff. So we now know what it's like. And therefore it should, I would counsel every leadership team in every business, particularly in your sectors, to look at business resilience going forward. Because until there's a vaccine for this pernicious disease, we are likely to get peaks again. And my fear for this particular industry, I keep saying your industry, I tend to work in media and entertainment, but obviously I do know your sector, and I know retail very well as well, which has had an absolutely horrendous time. My fear for your sectors is we will have partial, the lockdown will be partially released, whatever the words are, and we'll get into the autumn season. So you'll have a much slower, quicker season, and then we get into the, the seasonality of the industry sectors. So I think you should be looking at, restaurants should be looking at working with local authorities and other stakeholders to see, can they build marquees on the outside of their restaurants to increase their capacity so that restaurants don't have to shut and the business models work in the future. There's a lot of outside the box thinking that needs to be done over the next few months, because this virus, until there's a vaccine, this is a point Matt made earlier on, this thing could be going for another 18 to 24 months. And therefore leadership teams need to be able to look forward at every eventuality and be able to have proper plans in place, because there weren't any. I've seen the list here. No disrespect to any of the CEOs of your organization, but the preparedness for this pandemic just wasn't there. Sorry, Elliott.
No, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think that the lessons learned bit is probably the most critical thing that we can all do when we return to normal. Just wanted to share sort of three lessons that some of our clients in Asia have shared with us as they have returned to work and have started preparing for phase 2 and for phase 3. I think the first lesson that they've learned is that they didn't fully understand the psychological impact that lockdown would have had on their employees, and that even when people came back to work and even when desks were cleared between them, when they heard that there'd been a case of COVID-19 on the floor beneath in their office block, not even in their company, everyone wanted to go home. And people are just much more possibly traumatized by this than possibly we understand as leaders. Secondly, a lot of companies have tried to take some of the very practical lessons that they've learned from the last few months. Say, for example, in the UK, we had a Prime Minister and a Health Secretary in the same room at the same time, in a period of with an infectious disease. I think going forward, you probably will not put your CEO and your CFO in the same room at the same time. You probably won't even physically bring your exco together physically. So I think a lot of what we're doing now, we will actually carry on in terms of ways of working in the future. And I think the third one, and particularly interesting for the travel and hospitality sector, that is such a such an industry that depends on frontal leadership. Actually, I think going forward, in a way, frontal leadership may well do more harm than good. I.e., and I put myself in this category, I'm a super spreader. I spend my days meeting people. So the days of an ops director going from site to site possibly isn't sensible in a world where we don't yet have a vaccine and we don't yet have a way through this. I think there's a lot about the ways of our working practices that we probably need to change going forward.
There's a question from Sarah. How do you see the appetite for commercial strategic partnerships changing as we emerge from this crisis? Do you see opportunities for companies to change how they collaborate and share resources? Matt, is that one that you would like to?
I think this is a huge opportunity for everyone. Yes, I think that there is a huge opportunity for collaboration and partnerships and shared forces. And I think the more imaginative the organisation, the more opportunity there will be. And I think you will get a huge amount of coming together. And I think you'll have to, because again, if we take the longevity element, I think that it'll be difficult right now to form them, simply because coming together, having those discussions. But I would urge everyone to have conversations that you wouldn't normally be having, and to really look outside the box, because again, at the end of the day, and this is the reality of all sort of significant changes, is that they create massive amount of innovation and change. And so we're at a point when those that harness it will create new things, and it might be that the names change, but opportunities of coming together and sharing. So I would absolutely urge that, both from a country and a global perspective, because supply chains are all going to shift. And there's no question that one of the macro trends coming out is that countries are going to look at their own supply chain to a different level. So again, collaboration on a global scale is going to be really, really interesting.
Yeah. There is a comment from Susan about they have commenced, Susan at Martindale, Mitchells and Butlers, they have commenced employee forums, and as expected, we have seen evidence of concerns from our teams at all levels, brand level, head office level. I know that a number of companies that are here attending are constantly monitoring their employees' perceptions and attitude towards coming back to work. I know that some of them have asked their employees to volunteer to go and start the operational running behind the scenes of restaurants and pubs, but they've done it based on asking people to volunteer. One of the things that I think all of you have mentioned, which has come out really strongly, is all of this. One of the key traits of, I was speaking this morning to the CEO of a very large leisure business here in the UK, and he was saying one thing that this crisis has done to all of us leaders has increased our empathy. And so really understanding and appreciation for people, men and women, working from home, and the pressures of working from home. It has been said plenty of times, we're not working from home, we're trying to work remotely when managing, the cleaning, the vacuuming, and the children, and the schooling, and all of that. The husbands that has walked, behind me earlier on, and so we're all trying to manage this. And actually, as leaders, we've had to develop, if we didn't have that, empathy, and that's going to be one of the key skills, if you like, going forward. The whole focus on employees' well-being, mental health, as we return to work. I've not spoken. We had the advisory board, of the WiHTL advisory board on Monday, and every single one of the CEOs and chairpersons who was there talked about well-being, talked about looking after people emotionally. They said there is going to be a lot of support in terms of rules and regulations, the technical side of what we can and we can't do. What we need to focus on is looking after leaders and organizations from an emotional perspective. So all of that, compassion. We talked about communication, connection. All of this has been quite new for a lot of people, communicating virtually and all the tech side of things. So there is a lot in there. There is perhaps some organizations, and I know some, businesses that are part of the community were very, very good at the whole well-being and mental health. But, Elliott said one of the things to think about is the impact that the lockdown has had on people, psychologically. That is a big part. We'd like to bring just, possibly something back onto diversity and inclusion, and get your views as to whether the crisis is an opportunity for more diversity and inclusion going forward, or it's going to be, there is going to be kind of slower progress as we go forward, because the decisions have to be made really quickly, and so we can't be as inclusive as we used to be, or because suddenly the targets that companies had set in terms of gender or ethnicity, they just don't want to commit to those anymore. Any views on that before we wrap up?
I have one or two. So I think our sense is it's going to be mixed. On the negative side, if you look at what we went for, say with CFOs, we're going to be looking for people who have that resilience, who have probably been through some days before, previous financial crises, etc. And actually, that candidate pool is slightly older and definitely much more male. So that's a negative. And also, I think this has definitely slipped down a number of institutional investors' agenda. I think it's remained relatively high in the PLC world, but in the private equity world, it's almost sort of dropped from the conversation. And given that world is likely to come increasingly into travel and hospitality over the next period, I do think that's a concern. On the positive side, every time we do a report, as we do every year with WiHTL, and we speak to all the CEOs and the HRDs, and we ask them, why hasn't there been progress on X, Y, and Z role, function, etc. They talk about dead man shoes. We have a series of long-standing incumbents in roles, and in particular operational roles. I think as we see wholesale restructuring, organizational change, actually that does present a lot of opportunities. And as we've seen from the research that we've done with WiHTL, when new roles are created, actually there's a very good chance the diversity dial is shifted. And when we look at some of the new skills that we'll look to bring into the sector, particularly say around digital, actually it may well be possible to ensure more balanced skills. So I think it's a mixed message. I think we're going to see it being less important to some of the investors who have been driving the agenda, less important in terms of some of the more traditional roles that are going to require more seasoned candidates, but very positive in terms of the shake-up and the resulting opportunity for new talent to step into those roles.
Okay, thank you. Matt, I'll come to you for some final words of wisdom for our attendees.
Well, I mean, I do think you've got to always step back and remember this is a point in time. Quite early on when I set Criticaleye, there was a guy who was CEO of a FTSE 100, and I met him and we had a long conversation about life. And his comment was, it's really important in leadership that you remove yourself from the moment and you don't get emotional. I think no more so than now. It's really important that you're balanced. It's really important that you look after yourself. And, the well-being bit is important. This is going to be difficult. I mean, one of our members committed suicide the other day. And, that's it brings home to you the reality of the implication of leadership. And you are going to have to make difficult decisions. And I think that you've got to be very careful in your communication to get the balance right. I mean, I'm slightly worried about over-communication at the moment. You're coming towards points of change. Make sure you line everything up. If you're going to do things, do it once and do it well. And remember what your purpose is. Remember why you exist. And as long as you do those things, you know, you'll make the best of the scenario. And in life, that is our objective, is to make the best and to create the environment for the people coming through. You've got to remember, you're going to influence more people now than you ever would before. And the decisions you take today, the way that you lead individually, will have a huge impact.
Okay, thank you. Olly, I'll come to you for some final positive. Give us some positive at the end.
I think this forum's excellent. I've never attended one of your sessions before, Tara. I think it's really good. My positive thing is it's actually related to a point that Sarah said earlier on in one of the questions. This forum brings all sorts of different people and bodies together. So, you know, it's a phrase that a few of us have used on the panel today, thinking outside the box. There are opportunities for all of you to get in touch with one another post this forum, to talk about what are the things we can do. I noticed down the list earlier, you've got someone from the Odeon here, you've got someone from the parks, you've got Rowley, who provides tents. You know, there's no reason why you go outside of this forum and you think about what's the new route to market. Could we have an outdoor, you know, drive-through cinema on, you know, such and such a park? There's enough cleverness, streetwise savvy amongst this forum to come away from today, not only with your day-to-day business as usual, but thinking, who from this group can I create a new service or a new, you know, entrepreneurial idea with? And you know, that's what I'd encourage you to do.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let me then conclude by thanking Matthew, Olly and Elliott for sharing your reflections with us today. Thank you to all of you for participating and for your questions that have been coming through the chat and the Q&A box. Before I let you all go, I would like for you to invite you to join us next week, next Wednesday, same place, same beach, same time, and for our weekly webinar with guest speakers from PwC, Chris Box, and DWF, Kirsty Rogers, talking about the practicalities of returning to work. From an employee perspective, who comes back first, how the use of technology in a positive way, measure temperature, providing PPE, and very importantly, painting a vision, a positive vision for the future. Thank you all very much, and goodbye.
Thanks, Tara.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.